The year is 1840, in a small village nestled in the Carpathian Mountains, where superstition runs as deep as the blood in men's veins. For 3 centuries, a vampire named Elias has watched humanity from the shadows, bound by the ancient covenant that forbids his kind from ever approaching the living. He has kept this law without question, observing births, deaths, joys, and sorrows from a distance that protects both worlds. But on one frost-bitten November night, when a merchant's manor erupts into flames and a 12-year-old girl named Clara becomes trapped in the inferno, Elias breaks the most sacred rule of his existence. What he whispers to her in those burning moments will set in motion a tragedy so profound, so achingly beautiful, that it will redefine what it means to be human, to be monster, and to love someone you can never truly save. This is not a story of redemption. This is a story of sacrifice, of a child who learns that monsters wear many faces, and of an immortal creature who discovers that some rules are worth breaking, even if it costs him everything he has spent 300 years protecting. The flames reached toward the heavens like desperate prayers, orange and gold and furious red, consuming the merchant's manor with a hunger that reminded Elias of his own cursed thirst. He stood at the forest's edge, exactly where he had stood every night for the past 47 years, watching the village of Blackthorn from the shadows that had become his only companions. The ancient covenant whispered in his mind like it always did, a binding older than memory itself. Never approach the living, never let them see your face, never cross the threshold between their world and yours. For 3 centuries, he had obeyed without question, watching generations of humans live and die while he remained frozen in this terrible immortality, neither alive nor dead, permitted to exist only in the spaces between their firelight and their fears. But tonight something was different. Tonight, the screams carried a pitch that cut through his supernatural hearing like a blade through silk. Not the deep bellows of grown men or the sharp cries of women, but something higher, more fragile, the sound of a child trapped inside those flames. Elias felt his dead heart constrict in a way he had not experienced since the night they turned him, since the night his humanity was ripped away and replaced with this endless darkness. He told himself to turn away, to let the humans handle their own tragedies as they always had, to remember that his interference would bring catastrophe to both worlds. The Vampire Council would sense his transgression immediately, and the punishment for breaking the covenant was absolute. They would strip away the last fragments of his humanity, leaving him a mindless beast who knew only hunger and violence. The village men formed a chain with buckets from the well, their faces illuminated by the hellish glow, their movements frantic but organized in that way humans had when disaster struck. Women clutched each other and wept, their prayers rising above the roar of the flames. Elias could smell their fear, their desperation, could hear the rapid thundering of their hearts, even from this distance. And beneath it all, fading now, growing weaker with each passing second, he heard the small heartbeat inside the manor, irregular and frightened, a hummingbird caught in a storm. The girl was in the east wing, 3rd floor, trapped behind a collapsed beam, if his supernatural senses were correct. She had perhaps 2 minutes before the smoke claimed her. Perhaps 3 if fortune smiled upon innocence, which in his experience it rarely did. He watched Merchant Whitmore, the girl's father, screaming orders at the bucket brigade, his face a mask of anguish as he tried repeatedly to charge into the inferno, only to be held back by stronger men. The merchant had lost his wife to fever just 2 winters ago, Elias remembered, had raised his daughter alone with a tenderness that seemed rare among the wealthy. The man would not survive losing her too, would likely follow her into whatever afterlife humans believed awaited them, through rope or blade, or simply the slow death of a broken heart. Elias had seen it countless times before, the way grief could kill as surely as any disease. He had learned not to care, had trained himself to see humans as temporary creatures whose sufferings were as brief and meaningless as summer rain. But that heartbeat, that small, desperate heartbeat growing fainter with each passing moment, it would not let him turn away. Against every instinct of self-preservation, against 300 years of rigid discipline, Elias felt his feet moving forward. One step, then another, each one a violation of the ancient law, each one bringing him closer to the world of the living. The shadows that normally clung to him like loyal servants began to peel away, reluctant to follow him into this transgression. His body remembered how to move with human purpose rather than supernatural stealth, and for the first time in centuries he felt the weight of genuine choice pressing down upon him. He could still turn back, could retreat to his darkness and let nature take its course, could preserve the careful balance that kept his kind hidden and the humans safe from the predators in their midst. The heat hit him as he approached the manor. Waves of scorching air that would have blistered human skin, but only reminded him of the infernal realm where creatures like him surely belonged. The villagers were too focused on their futile efforts to notice one more figure emerging from the darkness, and Elias used their distraction to slip through a side entrance where the flames had not yet reached. Inside, the smoke was thick as wool, black and suffocating, filling the corridors with a darkness that even his vampire eyes struggled to penetrate. But he did not need sight when he could follow that heartbeat, that precious fragile rhythm that pulled him forward like a rope around his chest. Up the servants' staircase, through the music room where a piano burned with keys that screamed like dying children. Down the hallway where portraits of Whitmore ancestors watched him with oil-painted eyes that seemed to judge his presence here. The east wing was an inferno, the wallpaper curling and blackening, the floorboards groaning beneath his feet as fire consumed the support beams below. Elias moved with speed that blurred the world around him, faster than flame could spread, faster than smoke could fill his lungs, though he had no need to breathe. He found her in what must have been her bedroom, a space decorated with the careful love of a doting father, dolls arranged on shelves and books stacked beside a small writing desk. A massive beam from the ceiling had collapsed across the doorway, pinning the door shut and trapping the girl inside. Through the gap beneath the door he could see her, curled against the far wall beneath a window too small to escape through. Her white nightgown already grey with smoke, her dark hair matted to her forehead with sweat and tears. She was conscious, barely, her brown eyes wide with terror as she watched the flames crawl across her ceiling like living things. 12 years old, he had guessed correctly, caught in that awkward space between childhood and whatever came after, too young to understand the finality of death, but old enough to know she was facing it. When she saw his shadow through the smoke, saw this stranger appearing where no rescue should have been possible, she did not scream. Instead, she stared at him with an expression that would haunt whatever remained of his soul. Not hope exactly, but a desperate willingness to believe that impossible things might still happen, that monsters might sometimes save rather than devour. Elias gripped the fallen beam, and even with his supernatural strength it resisted, wedged tight and burning with heat that made his flesh sizzle and smoke. The pain was exquisite, a reminder that while he could not die easily, he could certainly suffer. He wrenched the beam aside with a sound like the earth breaking open, sending splinters of flaming wood scattering across the hallway. The door swung inward and he entered her room, this small sanctuary that would become her tomb if he failed. The girl tried to stand, but collapsed immediately, her lungs too full of smoke, her young body shutting down from the heat and terror. Elias scooped her up with the gentleness he had not used since he last held his own daughter 300 years ago, before the plague took her, before grief drove him to accept the vampire's dark gift, before he learned that immortality was just another word for endless loss. She weighed almost nothing in his arms, this fragile collection of bones and breath and beating heart. Her head lolled against his chest as consciousness fled, and he felt the whisper-thin pulse at her throat, saw the blue veins beneath her pale skin, smelled the copper-sweet scent of her blood singing through her body. The hunger rose in him instantly, that terrible bottomless need that defined his cursed existence, the urge to bite down and drink deep and take into himself this innocent life. He crushed the impulse with 3 centuries of practice, but it left him shaking as he turned back toward the hallway. The flames had spread with terrifying speed, cutting off the path he had taken. The staircase was now a waterfall of fire, the corridors transformed into channels of hell itself. There was only one way out now, and it required trusting that this small, fragile human could survive what came next. Elias moved to the window, the large one in the hallway just outside her room, and kicked it open in an explosion of glass and wooden frame. The cold November air rushed in, feeding the flames behind him, making them roar with renewed fury. Below, the bucket brigade continued their useless work, small figures moving in organized chaos. They would see him now, would see this stranger holding the merchant's daughter, and questions would follow that he could not afford to answer. But those were problems for later, if there was a later, if the council did not destroy him for this night's work. He gathered the girl closer, adjusted her limp form so her face pressed against his shoulder, then stepped up onto the window ledge. The drop was 40 feet at least, enough to kill a human, barely enough to inconvenience a vampire. He jumped, and for 3 perfect heartbeats, they flew together through the smoke-filled night. This monster and this child, falling toward earth like a fallen angel, and his unwitting companion. Elias twisted in mid-air, positioning his body beneath hers so he would take the impact, would break her fall with his own supernatural durability. They hit the frozen ground with force that would have shattered human bones, but he absorbed it, rolled with it, came up in a crouch with the girl still safe in his arms. Around him, the villagers stood frozen in shock, their buckets forgotten, their mouths open in questions that died before forming words. They saw a stranger in dark clothes, pale as death, holding their merchant's daughter, having appeared from impossible heights without injury. Superstition ran deep in these mountains, and Elias could see recognition dawning in some of their eyes. The old fears rising like bile in their throats, but Merchant Whitmore saw only his daughter, saw her chest still rising and falling with shallow breaths, saw possibility where moments before there had been only despair. The man rushed forward, arms outstretched, and Elias placed the girl into her father's embrace with a care that belied his monstrous nature. Their hands touched briefly in the transfer, human warmth meeting supernatural cold, and Whitmore's eyes widened as he truly saw his daughter's rescuer for the first time. Elias knew what the merchant observed, the too pale skin, the eyes that reflected the firelight like a wolf's, the complete absence of sweat or breathlessness, despite emerging from an inferno and a 40-foot fall. Fear and gratitude warred on Whitmore's face, creating an expression of such conflict that it might have been amusing under different circumstances. The girl stirred in her father's arms, coughing weakly, those brown eyes fluttering open to find first her father's face, and then, searching past his shoulder, finding Elias standing there in the firelight. Their gazes locked for just a moment, monster and child, savior and saved, and in that instant something passed between them that Elias could not name. Recognition, perhaps, or connection, or simply the acknowledgement that their lives had just become irrevocably entangled. She tried to speak, her smoke-damaged throat producing only a whisper that her father had to lean close to hear. But Elias heard it perfectly with his supernatural senses. Heard the 2 words that this 12-year-old girl spoke with absolute certainty, despite barely clinging to consciousness. "Thank you," she whispered, and then, as if she somehow knew exactly what he was, despite all reason and logic. "Please stay," but Elias was already backing away, already feeling the weight of what he had done, settling onto him like chains. The ancient covenant screamed in his mind now, a violation alarm that his kind would sense across continents. He had approached the living, had touched a human child, had revealed his presence and his nature to an entire village of witnesses. The council would come for him, would demand punishment, would make an example of his transgression to ensure no other vampire ever dared break the oldest law. He should run, should disappear into the night, and put as much distance as possible between himself and this place. But even as his mind calculated escape routes and hiding places, his eyes remained locked on that small, pale face, on those brown eyes that watched him with something far more dangerous than fear. She was looking at him like he mattered, like he was something more than the monster he had been for 300 years. And God help him, he found he could not simply disappear into darkness, could not abandon her to whatever questions and nightmares would follow this night. The rules were already broken, the damage already done. What harm could come from staying just a little longer, from ensuring she truly survived, from perhaps learning her name before the council's judgment fell upon him? It was foolish, reckless, the kind of thinking that got vampires destroyed. But Elias had not felt anything resembling purpose in longer than he could remember, and the way this child looked at him ignited something in his chest that he had thought long dead. So instead of fleeing into the forest, instead of accepting the mercy of distance and anonymity, Elias committed his second transgression of the night. He stepped forward again, moving closer to the humans rather than away, approaching the merchant, who now held his daughter like she might vanish if he loosened his grip. The other villagers retreated instinctively, forming a wide circle, their superstitious fear creating a buffer zone around the stranger who had done the impossible. But Whitmore held his ground, his merchant's mind perhaps more practical than his neighbor's, able to see past supernatural unease to the simple fact that this pale stranger had saved his daughter's life. "Who are you?" the merchant asked, and his voice carried only wonder without accusation, gratitude without suspicion, which made it somehow worse than if he had screamed accusations of witchcraft. Elias opened his mouth to lie, to offer some fabricated identity that would satisfy curiosity and allow him to escape. But the girl's eyes were still on him, cutting through 3 centuries of practiced deception. He found himself speaking the truth instead, or part of it at least, the fragment of truth that would not immediately condemn him. "My name is Elias Thorn. I was passing through the forest when I saw the fire. I could not stand by and do nothing. It was not precisely a lie, but nowhere close to the full truth." He had indeed been in the forest, and he had indeed seen the fire, but he had not been passing through. He had been watching this village every night for 47 years, a dark sentinel who knew its rhythms and routines better than most of its inhabitants. He knew when the baker rose at dawn, when the blacksmith banked his forge at dusk, when young lovers met in secret behind the church. He knew that Merchant Whitmore often worked late in his study, that his daughter liked to read by candlelight long after she should have been sleeping, that the servants sometimes stole extra rations and blamed it on rats. He knew everything about Blackthorn, except how it felt to be part of it, to exist as something other than a ghost, haunting its edges. "You saved my Clara," Whitmore said, and his voice broke on his daughter's name. Emotion overwhelming practiced merchant composure. "You risked your life for a child you do not even know. I am forever in your debt, Mr. Thorn." Clara, so that was her name, this small human who had managed to shatter 300 years of carefully maintained distance. It suited her somehow, clean and simple and suggesting light, everything that his darkness was not. She was watching him still, had not looked away even once since waking in her father's arms, and Elias found himself unable to retreat from that gaze. There was something in her eyes that he could not quite decipher. Not hero worship exactly, not simple childish gratitude, but something older, wiser, as if this 12-year-old girl could somehow see straight through his flesh to the cursed thing beneath. "No debt is owed," Elias said, and he meant it, though not for the noble reasons Whitmore would assume. "I did what anyone would have done." Another lie, though a kinder one. Most humans would not have charged into that inferno, would have valued their own lives above a stranger's child, would have mourned, but ultimately accepted tragedy as God's will. But Elias was not human, had not been human for longer than this village had existed, and his motivations were far more complicated than simple heroism. The manor behind them chose that moment to begin its final collapse. The support beams finally surrendering to flame and gravity. The building folded in on itself with a sound like the world ending, sending up a pillar of sparks that looked like 1,000 burning souls ascending to judgment. The villagers cried out and scattered, fearing the spread of fire to neighboring structures, but the wind was blowing away from town, and the bucket brigade had soaked the surrounding buildings. Only the Whitmore Manor would burn tonight. Only this one piece of their world would be consumed. Clara flinched at the sound, burying her face against her father's chest, her small body trembling with delayed shock. "Come," Whitmore said, turning away from his burning home with the kind of practicality that must have made him successful in business. "You cannot stay here in the cold after such exertion. My daughter needs attention from the physician, and you, sir, must allow me to properly thank you." He gestured toward the village proper, toward warm hearths and safety, and everything Elias should avoid. "I have rooms at the Black Swan Inn until other arrangements can be made. Please, I insist." It was the worst possible invitation, the most dangerous acceptance Elias could make. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to make polite excuses and disappear before he became more entangled in these human lives. But Clara had lifted her head again, was looking at him with those brown eyes that seemed to hold far too much understanding for a child her age, and he found himself nodding agreement before rational thought could intervene. He told himself it was just for tonight, just to ensure she recovered from the smoke, just to satisfy the curiosity that gnawed at him like hunger. One night would not matter in the grand scheme of his immortal existence, would barely register as a memory a decade from now. How wrong he was. How catastrophically, beautifully wrong. The Black Swan Inn smelled of pipe tobacco and yesterday's stew, of unwashed bodies, and the peculiar mustiness that accumulated in places where too many humans lived in too little space. Elias followed Merchant Whitmore through the common room, where a handful of villagers nursed their evening ales, their conversations dying as the strange, pale man passed through their midst. News of the fire had already spread, as news always did in small villages, traveling faster than flame itself through the networks of gossip and speculation that bound these communities together. Eyes tracked Elias with mixture of curiosity and unease, the same look humans had given his kind for millennia. That instinctive recognition of predator, even when the mind refused to accept what the body already knew. Clara had fallen asleep against her father's shoulder during the short walk from the burning manor, exhaustion and shock finally claiming consciousness. The physician had examined her briefly at the fire scene, declaring her lungs clear enough, though she would need monitoring through the night. And now she rested with the boneless trust that only children could manage, her soot-stained face peaceful despite the trauma so recently endured. Elias found himself watching the steady rise and fall of her breathing, that simple automatic function that separated the living from whatever he had become, and something twisted in his chest that might have been envy or longing or simply recognition of what he had lost when they turned him 3 centuries ago. Whitmore had secured 2 rooms on the inn's 2nd floor, modest accommodations by merchant standards, but clean and well-maintained. He carried his daughter into the first room and laid her gently on the narrow bed, brushing hair from her forehead with such tenderness that Elias had to look away from the intimacy of it. The merchant covered her with quilts that smelled of lavender and thyme, then stood for a long moment simply watching her breathe, his hands trembling with the aftermath of fear. When he finally turned back to Elias, his eyes were wet, though no tears had fallen. A man holding himself together through sheer force of will. "I thought I had lost her," Whitmore said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper to avoid waking his daughter. "When I saw the flames reach her wing, when none of my men could get through, I thought God was taking my last light from this world." He crossed to where Elias stood near the doorway, this careful distance maintained by instinct, even when invitation had been offered. "But then you appeared, like an angel sent to answer a prayer I had not even finished speaking. Tell me true, Mr. Thorne, how did you survive those flames? How did you reach her when my own men could not? The questions Elias had been dreading, the inquiries that would require either truth or elaborate deception, and he found himself dangerously close to choosing the former. There was something about Whitmore's direct gaze, about the honest bewilderment and gratitude mixing in his expression, that made lies feel heavier than usual. But truth was impossible. Would mark this merchant and his daughter for death by association, would bring the council's wrath down upon innocent heads. So Elias chose the middle path, the partial truth that might satisfy without revealing. "I am not easily harmed by fire," he said, which was accurate if misleading. Vampires could burn, but it took sustained heat and direct flame, and their supernatural healing meant they recovered from injuries that would cripple humans. And I have some experience with dangerous situations, with moving through spaces where others fear to tread. Also true. Though his dangerous situations typically involved hunting rather than rescuing, stalking rather than saving. Your daughter was fortunate that the beam fell as it did, creating a pocket of clearer air. A few minutes more and even I could not have reached her. Whitmore accepted this explanation with the practicality of a man who understood that some miracles did not bear close examination. He nodded slowly, then reached into his coat and withdrew a leather purse that clinked with the weight of coins. "Then allow me to offer payment for your bravery, Mr. Thorne. Name your price. And if I cannot meet it immediately, I will arrange—" "No!" Elias interrupted more sharply than intended, then softened his tone when Whitmore flinched. "Forgive me, but I cannot accept payment for such a deed. Your daughter's life is not a transaction to be settled with coin." He saw the merchant's face tighten with the kind of frustration that came from wanting to repay an unpayable debt, from understanding that gratitude without expression could become its own burden. "But if you wish to show thanks, then simply allow me to check on her welfare before I continue my journey. To know that she recovered fully would be payment enough." It was another dangerous choice, another extension of contact when he should be cutting ties and disappearing into the night. But even as he spoke the words, Elias knew he would not leave Blackthorn immediately, could not simply walk away without knowing that Clara survived her ordeal. The council would find him regardless of where he fled, would sense his transgression and track him down for judgment, so what did it matter if he delayed a few days? He had already broken the ancient covenant, had already touched a human child, and revealed his presence to an entire village. The additional sin of lingering seemed almost trivial by comparison. "Like worrying about muddy boots while the house burned down around you. You speak as though you intend to leave us," Whitmore said, and there was disappointment in his voice, perhaps even hurt, as if this stranger who had saved his daughter somehow owed them more than rescue. "Surely you will stay in Blackthorn at least a few days. Winter approaches and the mountain passes grow treacherous. I have business connections throughout the region, recommendations I could provide, introductions to make if you seek employment or opportunity." He paused, seeming to wrestle with something before speaking again. "And Clara would want to thank you properly when she wakes. She would never forgive me if I allowed her rescuer to vanish like morning mist." The offer was generous and entirely too dangerous, exactly the kind of entanglement Elias needed to avoid. But before he could formulate a polite refusal, a small voice spoke from the bed. Rough with smoke damage, but clear enough in the quiet room. "Please stay," Clara said, the same words she had whispered at the fire. And when Elias turned to look at her, he found those brown eyes open again, watching him with an intensity that seemed far beyond her 12 years. "At least until morning, Mr. Thorne. I would very much like to speak with you when I am not quite so close to dying." There was something in the way she said it, a dry humor threading through the trauma, that reminded Elias painfully of his own daughter so long ago. Elizabeth had possessed that same quality, that ability to find lightness even in darkness, to make jokes when fear threatened to overwhelm. She had kept that humor even as the plague consumed her, even as her small body burned with fever and her lungs filled with fluid. cracking wise until the very end about finally getting to sleep as long as she wanted. He had held her as she died, had felt her last breath against his neck, and in the aftermath of that loss, he had made the worst choice of his long existence, accepting the vampire's offer of immortality because he could not bear the thought of following his daughter into the grave, could not face the nothingness that awaited. 300 years later, he still questioned that choice, still wondered if cowardice had masqueraded as survival instinct, if his fear of death had condemned him to something far worse than dying. But looking at Clara now, at this child who had come so close to her own ending, Elias felt a strange shift in perspective. Perhaps his cursed existence had purpose after all. Perhaps 3 centuries of darkness had been preparation for this single night, for being in the right place to save one small life that deserved saving. It was grandiose, thinking the kind of meaning-making humans did to cope with tragedy, but he found himself wanting to believe it anyway. Very well, Elias heard himself say, committing to yet another poor decision in a night full of them. I will stay until morning, and we will speak when you have rested. He glanced at Whitmore, who was looking between his daughter and her rescuer with an expression that mixed relief and curiosity in equal measure. But I require very little, just a room where I might wait out the night. I do not sleep much, so please do not concern yourself with my comfort. Another truth hiding deeper truth. Vampires did not sleep at all in the human sense, instead falling into a death-like trance during daylight hours when the sun's power forced them into unconsciousness. Night was their natural state. Darkness, their element, and Elias had not experienced genuine sleep since the night they turned him. He missed it sometimes. Missed dreams and the soft dissolve of consciousness, missed waking refreshed rather than simply returning to awareness like a machine starting up again. But mostly he had grown accustomed to the endless waking, to the long hours of darkness that stretched like eternity, to existing in a state between life and death where neither world fully claimed him. Whitmore arranged for the second room and left them with promises to check on Clara throughout the night, his merchant's mind already working through the logistics of lost home and displaced life, the practical concerns that would occupy him once immediate crisis passed. When the door closed behind him, Elias found himself alone with the girl for the first time since pulling her from the flames, and the silence between them felt weighted with unspoken things. Clara had propped herself up against the headboard, her dark hair wild around her pale face, soot still smudging her cheeks and forehead. She studied him with a directness that most adults could not maintain, her brown eyes tracking across his features with what seemed like scientific curiosity rather than childish wonder. "You are very pale," she said finally, with the blunt honesty that children sometimes wielded like weapons. "And your hands were terribly cold when you carried me, even though you had just come through fire. The physician says people in shock can feel cold, but you do not seem shocked, Mr. Thorne. You seem very calm, actually, calmer than anyone else tonight." Elias felt something like alarm spike through him, a warning that this child was far too observant for comfort, far too willing to speak uncomfortable truths that others might think, but never voice. He should deflect, should offer some reasonable explanation that would satisfy her curiosity without feeding it, but instead he found himself responding with his own blunt honesty. "I have seen many terrible things in my life, Clara, perhaps too many things, enough that fire and crisis no longer affect me as they once did. And I have always run cold, a quirk of my constitution that doctors have never quite explained." Lies. Wrapped around truth, wrapped around lies. A nested deception that felt more exhausting than simply telling her what he was. But that was impossible, would be cruel even, to burden a 12-year-old child with knowledge of monsters walking among them. "You are very observant for someone who just survived such an ordeal. Most people in your position would still be trembling with shock. Clara considered this, her head tilting slightly in a gesture that would have seemed bird-like if not for the weight of intelligence behind it. "I was very frightened in the fire," she admitted, and her voice wavered slightly, the first crack in her composed facade. "I thought I was going to die, Mr. Thorne. I could not breathe properly, and everything was so hot, and I kept thinking about my mother, about whether dying would hurt as much as missing her does." Her hands twisted in the quilt covering her lap, small fingers knotting and unknotting the fabric. "But then you came through the smoke like something from a story, and I thought perhaps I was already dead, and you were an angel come to collect me. Except angels are supposed to be warm, are they not? And you were very, very cold." The observation hung between them like an accusation, or perhaps an invitation, and Elias found himself at a crossroads that he had not anticipated. He could continue the deception, could maintain the careful fiction of humanity, and slowly extract himself from these lives before his presence caused more harm. Or he could offer her something closer to truth, not the full terrible reality, but enough honesty to satisfy her clearly formidable mind, enough respect for her intelligence to acknowledge that she had sensed something beyond normal in her rescue. It was dangerous and foolish and broke several more rules about revealing their kind to humans, but looking at her earnest face, at the way she watched him without fear, despite every reason to be afraid, Elias found himself choosing the latter path. "I'm not an angel," he said quietly, moving closer to sit in the wooden chair beside her bed, close enough to speak without being overheard through thin walls, but maintaining that careful distance that protected them both. Quite the opposite, actually, if old stories are to be believed. "But I am also not entirely what I appear to be, and you are correct to notice the differences." He watched her expression sharpen with interest rather than fear, saw her lean forward slightly, as if afraid to miss a single word. "There are things in this world that exist beyond common understanding, Clara, creatures that live in the spaces between what people believe and what they know to be true. I am one such creature, though not one you need fear, at least not tonight." It was perhaps the most honest thing he had said to a human in decades, if not centuries, and the relief of partial truth felt like removing a too tight coat. Clara absorbed his words with remarkable calm, her young face serious and thoughtful rather than frightened or disbelieving. She was quiet for a long moment, processing, and Elias could almost see her sharp mind working through implications and possibilities, testing his revelation against her observations and finding it fit. "Are you a ghost?" she asked finally, and there was hope in her voice, a desperate edge that he did not immediately understand. "My mother died 2 years ago from fever, and I have read that ghosts sometimes appear to help the living, to finish business they left undone. Are you someone's ghost, Mr. Thorne? Are you bound to this place by tragedy?" The question surprised him with its specificity, with the clear evidence of a mind that had spent time contemplating mortality and what came after. But more than that, it revealed the shape of her hope, the reason she looked at him with such intensity. She was not afraid of the supernatural, because she wanted the supernatural to be real, wanted proof that death was not an ending, that her mother might still exist somewhere in some form. It was a child's grief, wearing the mask of curiosity, and it made his chest ache with recognition of his own ancient mourning. "No," he said gently, hating to disappoint her but unable to offer false comfort. "I am not a ghost, and I have no knowledge of what happens to spirits after death. I am something else entirely, something that never died in the way your mother did, but also something that can never truly live as humans do. I exist in between, Clara, neither one thing nor the other, and it is a lonely place to be." She absorbed this with visible disappointment, her shoulders sagging slightly, the brief hope extinguishing in her eyes. But then she rallied, that fierce intelligence reasserting itself, and she fixed him with a look that demanded truth rather than comfort. Then what are you, Mr. Thorne? If not a ghost, then what manner of creature breaks every natural law to save a child from fire? What being lives between life and death? Elias met her gaze and made a choice that would alter both their destinies irrevocably. I am very old, Clara, older than this village, older than your grandparents' grandparents. I do not age as humans do not sicken or die from ordinary causes. I exist in darkness, watching the world turn without me, observing life without truly participating in it. And I am bound by rules, ancient laws that govern my kind, the most important of which I broke tonight when I pulled you from those flames. He did not speak the word vampire, could not quite bring himself to name the monster, even in this moment of honesty, but he saw understanding dawn in her expression anyway. She had clearly read stories, had absorbed the folklore that every mountain village passed down through generations, warnings about the creatures that hunted in darkness. But instead of the fear that should have accompanied such recognition, Clara's face showed something far more complex, a mixture of fascination and sadness and strange understanding. "You broke your rules to save me," she said softly, and it was not a question but a statement of fact, of comprehension of what such choice must have cost. "You did something forbidden, something that will bring you trouble, and you did it anyway." Her eyes filled with tears that she blinked away furiously, trying to maintain composure. "Why? Why would you risk everything for a human girl you do not even know?" It was the question Elias had been asking himself since the moment he stepped from the forest shadows, the question that had no satisfactory answer because he did not fully understand his own motivations. He had told himself it was simply inability to watch a child die, but that was insufficient explanation given how many children he had watched die over 3 centuries, how many tragedies he had observed without intervention. There was something specific about this girl, about this moment, that had pierced through his carefully maintained detachment, but he could not name what quality she possessed that others had lacked. "I heard your heartbeat," he said finally, offering the only truth he could articulate. "In all that chaos, in all that noise and fear and flame, I heard your heart beating, and I could not turn away from it. Perhaps I am simply tired of watching, Clara. Perhaps 300 years of standing apart has worn me down until I no longer remember why the rules matter. Or perhaps you reminded me of someone I lost long ago, someone I could not save, and I thought that maybe, just this once, I could make different choices." Clara reached out then, her small hand extending toward him in a gesture of comfort that should have been reversed, that should have seen him consoling her rather than accepting her sympathy. But that was the strange gift of children, Elias. Thought. Their ability to recognize pain in others, even when drowning in their own, their instinct toward connection, even when all logic suggested retreat. Her fingers wrapped around his hand, warm life pressing against cold death, and she held on with surprising strength. "Thank you," she whispered, "for making different choices, for breaking your rules, for hearing my heartbeat when no one else could. I do not know what trouble you will face because of tonight, but I want you to know that my life was worth saving, that I intend to do something meaningful with the years you have given me back." It was a promise from a 12-year-old girl, earnest and heartfelt and probably impossible to keep given how unpredictable human lives were, but Elias found himself believing her anyway. Or perhaps just wanting to believe, wanting to think that his transgression had purpose beyond simple impulse, that breaking the ancient covenant might lead to something other than his own destruction. They sat together in that small room above, the Black Swan Inn, monster and child, savior and saved, their hands joined across the infinite distance between their worlds. And for the first time in 300 years, Elias did not feel quite so alone in his darkness. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, soft flakes drifting past the window like cold white stars, covering the ashes of the Whitmore Manor and making the world clean again, at least on the surface. But Elias knew that beneath that pristine covering, consequences were already taking root, growing toward a reckoning that neither he nor Clara could possibly imagine. The ancient covenant had been broken, and the council would come. They always did. Dawn came like a thief, stealing the darkness that Elias had wrapped around himself like armor. He felt the sun's approach before the first grey light touched the horizon, that inexorable pull toward unconsciousness that no amount of will could resist. It was the curse's most absolute requirement that during daylight hours his kind must surrender to the death sleep, must become as corpses in whatever dark place they had secured, vulnerable and insensate, until night returned to wake them. He had perhaps 30 minutes before the compulsion became overwhelming, before his body simply shut down, regardless of where he stood or what danger surrounded him. Clara had finally fallen into genuine sleep around midnight, her hand slipping from his as exhaustion claimed her, and Elias had spent the remaining hours watching her breathe, memorizing the peaceful expression on her soot-stained face, wondering if this would be the last time he saw her before the council's judgment fell. He should leave now, should slip away before the village woke and questions multiplied, should put distance between himself and these humans who had become dangerously important in the space of a single night. But the sun's approach made flight impossible, left him with the grim necessity of finding secure shelter within Blackthorn itself, somewhere dark and hidden where he could survive the vulnerable daylight hours without discovery. The room Whitmore had secured would not suffice, not with servants coming and going, not with the very real possibility that someone might enter while he lay in death sleep and realize exactly what manner of creature they had welcomed into their midst. Elias rose from the chair where he had kept vigil, his movements silent despite the old floorboards, and crossed to the window to gauge how much time remained. The sky was still mostly dark, but tinged with grey at the eastern edge. That warning, twilight, that meant perhaps 20 minutes before the sun's power reached him. Not enough time to reach the forest and his usual lair, barely enough time to find alternative shelter. He turned back to look at Clara one final time, this child who had managed to unravel 3 centuries of careful isolation in a single evening, and found her eyes open, watching him with that unsettling awareness that seemed her natural state. "You have to leave," she said quietly, understanding in her voice that should not have been possible. "The sun is coming, and creatures like you cannot bear its light. I have read the stories, Mr. Thorne. I know what happens to your kind when day breaks. The stories were mostly wrong, sensationalized tales meant to frighten children into good behavior, but they contained enough truth to be dangerous. Sunlight would not cause him to burst into flame or crumble to dust as folklore suggested, but it would force the death sleep upon him, would render him as helpless as an infant for the duration of daylight. And if someone found him in that state, if they realized what he was, a wooden stake through the heart would indeed end his long existence. It was the vulnerability that kept his kind cautious, that enforced the ancient rules about hiding and distance, that made every sunrise a calculated risk. "You should not have been reading such stories," Elias said, attempting levity he did not feel. "They will give you nightmares, fill your head with shadows and fears." But even as he spoke, he was moving toward the door, urgency building in his chest as the sun's pull grew stronger. "Go back to sleep, Clara. When you wake, your father will be here, and you can begin putting your life back together. Forget about me, about tonight, about creatures that exist in spaces between." "I will not forget," Clara said, and there was steel in her young voice, determination that he recognized as dangerous. "And I will not let you simply disappear as though you never existed, as though you did not save my life and break your rules doing it." She sat up despite obvious exhaustion, despite her body's need for rest and recovery. "Where will you go? You said you do not sleep much, but that was a lie, was it not? You must sleep during the day, must hide from the sun, and you have nowhere in this village to do so safely." Her perception was remarkable and entirely too accurate, and Elias found himself caught between admiration for her intelligence and frustration at her refusal to simply let him leave. "It is not your concern," he said, more sharply than intended. "I have survived for 300 years, Clara. I am quite capable of managing one sunrise." Another lie, this one more desperate, because he genuinely did not know where he would shelter, and time was running out with every passing second. Clara pushed back the quilts and swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet finding the cold floor. She swayed slightly with dizziness, smoke-damaged lungs and shock taking their toll, but she steadied herself with one hand on the bedpost and fixed him with a look that brooked no argument. "The church," she said. "There is a crypt beneath it, old stone vaults where they buried the village founders. My father made a donation last year, and Father Michael showed us the lower levels, showed us tombs that date back centuries. No one goes down there except on All Saints' Day, and that was 3 weeks ago. You would be safe there, Mr. Thorne, safe and hidden until darkness returns." It was brilliant and terrible suggestion, exactly the kind of solution his desperate situation required, but also fraught with dangerous irony. A vampire sheltering in a church crypt, hiding among Christian dead in consecrated ground. It was the sort of thing that would have made him laugh if circumstances were less dire. But Clara was right. It would be secure and undisturbed, and the old superstitions about holy ground being anathema to his kind were just that, superstitions without substance. He had walked through churches before when necessity demanded, had even attended services in his distant human past, and while the symbols made him vaguely uncomfortable, they held no real power to harm him. "You should not be out of bed," Elias said, but he was already moving toward her, already accepting her solution because no better option existed. "And you should not be helping me." "Clara, if your father knew what I was, if anyone in this village understood, they would see you as tainted by association, corrupted by contact with darkness. Then they would be fools," Clara said simply. And she smiled at him, this small, fierce smile that contained more courage than most adults could muster. "You saved me, Mr. Thorne. You pulled me from fire when everyone else had given up hope. Whatever you are, whatever rules you broke, you are also the reason I lived to see this morning. Let me repay that gift even in some small way. Let me help you find sanctuary." There was no time to argue, no opportunity for the lengthy moral discussion her suggestion deserved. The sun's pull was becoming overwhelming now, making his limbs heavy, clouding his thoughts with the approaching death sleep. Elias nodded once, accepting, and Clara moved to the wardrobe where her father must have placed some of her salvaged belongings. She pulled out a dark cloak, heavy wool lined with fur, and wrapped it around herself despite still wearing only her nightgown. Then she opened the door and checked the hallway, finding it empty in these pre-dawn hours when even the inn's servants still slept. They moved through the silent building like ghosts themselves, Clara leading the way with surprising confidence for someone who had nearly died hours earlier. Her bare feet made no sound on the wooden stairs, and she navigated by familiarity, even in the dim light, having apparently spent enough time at the Black Swan to know its layout. Elias followed, his supernatural grace making him equally silent, though he could feel his coordination deteriorating as the sun climbed closer to the horizon. The death sleep was coming whether he found shelter or not, and if it caught him in the open street, he would fall like a puppet with cut strings, vulnerable to whatever discovery morning brought. The village was tomb quiet as they emerged into the cold air. That deep stillness that settled over communities in the hours before dawn, when even insomniacs surrendered to exhaustion. Snow covered everything now. Several inches accumulated overnight, muffling their footsteps and making the world seem wrapped in cotton silence. Clara's breath formed white clouds in the freezing air, but Elias produced no such vapor, another small tell that marked him as something other than human. She noticed He saw her glance at the absence where his breath should be, but she said nothing, just pulled her cloak tighter and led him down the empty street toward the church. The building loomed against the lightening sky, all dark stone and Gothic arches, built 2 centuries ago by villagers who took their faith seriously and their architecture even more so. A bell tower stretched toward heaven like an accusing finger, and stained glass windows depicted scenes of salvation and damnation in colors that the approaching dawn would soon illuminate. Clara led him around to the side entrance, a small wooden door that opened onto stairs descending into darkness, and Elias felt a rush of relief so profound it was almost painful. She'd been right, this would work, he would survive another day, but before they could descend, a voice cut through the morning stillness like a blade. "Clara? Clara Whitmore, is that you?" Father Michaels emerged from the rectory next door, a shawl thrown over his nightshirt, his elderly face creased with concern. "Child, what are you doing out here in the cold? Your father told me of the fire, of your miraculous rescue. You should be resting, not wandering about in the snow." Clara turned to face the priest, positioning herself between him and Elias in a protective gesture that was as touching as it was futile. "Father Michaels, forgive me. I could not sleep, needed air after being trapped in smoke for so long. I thought perhaps a prayer in the church might settle my mind." The lie came easily to her lips, smooth and practiced, and Elias realized that this girl had clearly learned deception from watching her merchant father negotiate. "This is Mr. Thorne, the man who saved me from the flames. He was kind enough to escort me to ensure I did not fall in my weakened state." The priest's gaze shifted to Elias, and even in the dim light, the old man's eyes narrowed, with something that might have been recognition or suspicion, or simply the unease that Elias's presence tended to provoke in the devout. Father Michaels had lived in Blackthorn for 40 years, had probably heard stories of strange occurrences in the forest, of travelers who disappeared and livestock found drained of blood. Whether he consciously believed in creatures like Elias was unclear, but his faith made him sensitive to presences that others might dismiss. "Mr. Thorne," the priest said slowly, and his voice carried the careful neutrality of someone trying to place an unsettling memory. "I heard of your heroism last night, heard that you appeared as if from nowhere to save young Clara when all hope seemed lost. The village is grateful for your intervention, though I confess I wonder where you came from, why a stranger happened to be passing through Blackthorn at precisely the moment a child needed saving." It was polite interrogation, curiosity wrapped in gratitude, but Elias heard the underlying suspicion. He could feel the sun now, perhaps 5 minutes from breaking the horizon, could feel his body beginning to shut down despite his desperate need to remain conscious. He swayed slightly, catching himself against the church wall, and Clara's hand shot out to steady him with surprising strength for someone her size. "Mr. Thorne is exhausted." "Father," Clara said quickly, covering for his weakness. "He breathed so much smoke, pulling me out, injured himself in ways he will not speak of out of modesty. I convinced him to come to the church with me, thought perhaps you might bless him, might offer prayers of protection for someone who risked his life for a stranger." She looked up at Elias with an expression of such earnest concern that it almost seemed genuine rather than performance. He should rest, should not be standing in the cold after such exertion. Father Michaels studied them both. This unlikely pair of child and stranger, and Elias could practically see the calculation happening behind the priest's eyes. But whatever conclusion the old man reached, it apparently bent toward charity rather than suspicion. Perhaps because turning away a hero would reflect poorly on Christian hospitality. Perhaps because Clara's obvious concern seemed authentic enough to overcome unease. "Of course," Father Michaels said, though reservation colored his tone. "Come inside, both of you. The church is always open to those who seek sanctuary." The word sanctuary hung in the air with unintended irony. "I will prepare some hot tea, fetch blankets. Mr. Thorne, you look positively grey with exhaustion. Whatever injuries you sustained, they require attention." They followed the priest into the church. and Elias felt the building's atmosphere press against him like a physical weight. Not painful exactly, but uncomfortable in ways he could not fully articulate. Sacred spaces held power of a sort, accumulated faith, creating pressure that beings like him registered as unease. But it was bearable, and more importantly, it would keep him hidden during the vulnerable day hours. Clara kept close to his side, her small hand wrapped around his wrist as if she could physically anchor him to consciousness through force of will alone. The church interior was all dark wood and stone, shadows pooling in corners where lamplight did not reach. The altar draped in purple cloth, appropriate to the liturgical season. Father Michaels lit several candles, their flames creating dancing shadows that made the carved saints seem to move, seem to watch with judgment. He gestured toward the pews near the front, inviting them to sit, but Clara shook her head. "Father, might Mr. Thorne rest in the crypt?" she asked, and her voice held just the right note of innocent concern. It would be quieter down there, darker and more conducive to sleep after such trauma. And cooler, which might help if he has fever from smoke inhalation. The priest hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the suggestion but unable to articulate why, without seeming inhospitable. The crypt was sacred ground, burial place of honored dead, not typically used for accommodating living guests. But it was also exactly what Elias needed, and Clara knew it, was manipulating the situation with skill that would have impressed him if he had mental capacity left for impression. The death sleep was coming, perhaps 2 minutes now, and he could feel his legs beginning to buckle. "Please, Father," Elias managed, his voice rough with effort. "The child is right. I need darkness and quiet. Just for the day, just to recover. By nightfall I will be gone, will not trouble your hospitality further." Something in his tone, some desperation breaking through, seemed to convince Father Michaels. The priest nodded slowly, then retrieved a key from his vestments and led them to a door behind the altar, one that opened onto stone steps, descending into cold darkness. "The crypt is old," he warned, "and not particularly comfortable. But if you truly require solitude, you will find it there. I will check on you at midday, bring food and water." "No," Elias said too quickly, too forcefully, then gentled his voice when the priest flinched. "Please, I need uninterrupted rest. I'm a very light sleeper, and any disturbance could undo the benefits of recuperation. If you could simply allow me privacy until sunset, I would be most grateful." Father Michaels looked like he wanted to argue, but Clara stepped in again, her young face arranged in an expression of such pleading concern that the old priest melted visibly. "Let him rest, Father. He saved my life, gave everything to pull me from the flames. The least we can offer is undisturbed sanctuary for a day." The priest relented, handing Elias the key with obvious reluctance. "Very well. Lock the door from the inside if you wish absolute privacy. But, Mr. Thorne, I will expect to see you at sunset to ensure you are well. And perhaps then we might discuss your plans, where you travel next. Whether Blackthorn might convince you to stay longer." The invitation carried an undercurrent of something darker than hospitality, a suggestion that departure might be preferable to extended visit. Elias took the key, feeling metal burn against his palm like ice or fire, and nodded his thanks. Then he descended into the crypt, with Clara following close behind, ignoring the priest's protest that she should remain above, that the burial vaults were no place for a young girl. The steps seemed endless, each one requiring tremendous effort as his body shut down incrementally, and only Clara's steadying hand kept him from tumbling forward into darkness. Finally they reached the bottom, entering a space of stone and silence, ancient tombs lining the walls like patient sentinels, the air thick with dust and time, and the peculiar stillness of places where the living rarely tread. "Here," Clara said, guiding him to a stone bench against the far wall. "The only furniture in this place of perpetual rest. Lie down quickly, before you fall." Her voice held urgency, understanding that his time had nearly expired. "Will you be all right? Will this sleep harm you?" Elias collapsed onto the bench, feeling his consciousness fragmenting as the sun finally broke the horizon somewhere far above. His last sight was Clara's face hovering over him, worry creasing her young features, and he managed one final whisper before the death sleep claimed him completely. "Stay safe," he breathed. "Do not let anyone know what I am. Promise me." "I promise," Clara said. And then the darkness took him, pulled him down into the void where vampires spent their days, into the death that was not death, but only the closest approximation his cursed existence allowed. His last thought was that he had placed tremendous trust in a 12-year-old girl, that his continued survival now rested in her hands, and that this was perhaps the most foolish thing he had done in 3 centuries of foolish choices. Above ground, Clara Whitmore locked the crypt door and returned the key to Father Michaels, explaining that Mr. Thorne had insisted on privacy and had taken the key with him, would return it at sunset. The priest accepted this with visible discomfort, but said nothing more, and Clara walked back through the snowy village to the Black Swan Inn, her mind already working through implications and possibilities. She had read enough stories to understand what Elias was, had pieced together the truth from his careful admissions and her own observations. A vampire had saved her life, had broken his kind's most sacred rules to pull her from flames, and now lay vulnerable in her village's church crypt. Clara understood the weight of the secret she carried, understood that one word to the wrong person could mean Elias's destruction. But she also understood something else, something that crystallized in her mind with absolute certainty as she climbed the stairs to her father's room. Elias had saved her not because he had to, not because any rule or instinct compelled him, but because he had chosen to value her life above his own safety. That choice, that single moment of deciding one small human girl mattered more than 3 centuries of careful preservation, was perhaps the most human thing anyone had ever done for her. And Clara Whitmore did not forget kindness, did not abandon those who had sacrificed for her. Whatever consequences Elias faced for breaking his rules, whatever judgment his kind might levy, she would stand with him. She was 12 years old and powerless in most ways, but she had her father's cunning and her mother's fierce loyalty, and she would find a way to repay the debt she owed. The village might call him monster, might fear the creature sleeping beneath their church, but Clara knew better. Sometimes monsters were the ones who saved you, and sometimes humans were the ones you needed saving from. Elias woke to darkness and the sound of crying. For a disoriented moment he could not place either sensation. 300 years of routine shattered by the unfamiliar weight of stone above him, and the soft, desperate sobbing somewhere close by. Then memory flooded back in a rush that was almost physical. The fire, the girl, the ancient covenant broken, the sun forcing him into vulnerable sleep in a church crypt where any number of disasters might have befallen him. He sat up too quickly, supernatural reflexes engaging before conscious thought, and his eyes adjusted instantly to the absolute darkness of the burial vault. Clara sat huddled against the opposite wall, her knees drawn to her chest, tears streaming down her face in the dim light of a single candle she must have brought with her. "Clara," he said, and his voice came out rougher than intended. The death sleep always left him feeling hollowed out for the first few minutes after waking. "What has happened? Are you hurt?" He crossed to her in a movement too fast for human perception, then forced himself to slow, to remember that his nature could frighten even those who claimed to accept it. "Why are you down here alone? Where is your father?" She looked up at him with eyes gone red from weeping, her young face blotchy and swollen, and for a moment she could not seem to find words. Then it all came tumbling out in a rush, fragmented sentences punctuated by hiccuping sobs. "They came this afternoon, men in dark clothes riding black horses, and they asked questions about you, Mr. Thorne. They spoke to Father Michaels, to the villagers who saw you at the fire, to my father. They said you were dangerous, that you had broken laws and must face judgment. that anyone who helped you would share your punishment." Her hands twisted in her skirt, knuckles white with tension. "Father Michaels told them about the crypt, told them you were resting here. I tried to warn you, tried to unlock the door, but it would not open from the outside without the key, and you had it with you, and I could not wake you, no matter how loud I knocked." The council had come, faster than Elias had anticipated, tracking him through whatever supernatural means they employed to sense covenant violations. He had known they would come eventually, had accepted that his transgression would demand accounting, but he had hoped for more time, for days at least, to ensure Clara fully recovered before his presence brought danger to her doorstep. The fact that they had already questioned the villagers, already identified his shelter, meant they were moving with unusual urgency. They must have sensed not just the rule-breaking, but something more, some quality to his choice that threatened their carefully maintained order. "Where are they now?" Elias asked, forcing calm into his voice, though alarm spiked through him. "These men in dark clothes, are they waiting above?" If the council representatives were in the church, he was effectively trapped, the crypt having only one entrance and exit. And while he could fight his way through human servants, the council always traveled with older vampires, enforcers who possessed centuries of experience and power that exceeded his own. Clara shook her head, wiping at her tears with the back of her hand. "They left at sunset, said they would return after full dark, said you would come out eventually when hunger drove you to hunt." She said the word hunt without flinching. This child who somehow understood what he was and what he needed to survive. Father Michaels locked the church, said no one was to enter until they returned, but I climbed through the vestry window. "I had to warn you, had to tell you they were coming." She had risked herself to warn him. This 12-year-old girl who owed him nothing beyond the life he had saved, who could have simply remained safe in her father's rooms while the monsters sorted out their own affairs. The knowledge settled into Elias's chest like a stone, heavy and warm and entirely too dangerous. She should not care what happened to him, should not place herself between a vampire and the council's justice. But here she was in the darkness beneath a church, tears still wet on her face, determined to help even when help seemed impossible. "You should not have come," Elias said, but his voice held no real rebuke, only weary gratitude and the terrible awareness that her involvement made everything more complicated. "If they find you helped me, if they discover you warned me against their return, they will not simply punish me, Clara. The council has rules about humans who know too much, who interfere in our affairs. They will see you as a threat to the secrecy that keeps our kind hidden." The implication hung between them, unspoken but clear. The council would kill her, would eliminate the witness and the complication she represented, and they would do it with the casual efficiency of creatures who had existed for centuries and viewed human lives as ephemeral and ultimately meaningless. Elias had seen it before, had watched the council's justice fall upon humans whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time, knowing things they should not know. He could not allow that fate to befall Clara, could not let his broken rules destroy the very life he had risked everything to save. Resignation and fear. Elias found himself nodding, even as tears he had not cried in 300 years began to fall. "I promise," he whispered. "I will live, will honor your memory by remaining who I am rather than letting grief transform me into something less. But Clara, I do not know how to face centuries without you. Do not know how to return to the loneliness I knew before you came into my life." "You will learn," Clara said, and her certainty carried weight of someone who had spent years contemplating her own mortality. "Just as I learned to live after my mother died, just as you learned to live after losing your humanity to the vampire's curse. We endure, Elias, because that is what living things do. We endure and we remember, and we carry forward the love we were given even when those who gave it are gone." She leaned forward slowly, painfully, and pressed her forehead against his. In gesture of intimacy they had rarely permitted themselves. "I love you, have loved you for 27 years. will love you until my heart stops beating, and probably beyond that if consciousness continues after death. And that love will not be wasted even when I am gone, because it changed you, made you capable of connection you thought you had lost centuries ago. That is my legacy. That is what survives my mortality. They stayed like that for long minutes, foreheads pressed together, breathing the same air, existing in bubble of closeness that the council's monitors could not quite classify as violation, but that held more intimacy than many physical embraces. And Elias felt the terrible truth settling into him like poison or medicine, the understanding that he would survive her death because she was asking him to, because honoring her memory meant living rather than simply enduring. It was the cruelest gift she could have given him, this obligation to continue when every instinct screamed to follow her into whatever darkness awaited. But he accepted it because refusing would be refusing her. And he had never been able to refuse Clara anything. The year that followed was both the most beautiful and most terrible of Elias's long existence. Clara visited less frequently as her condition worsened. Her trips to the cottage spaced further apart as walking became increasingly difficult and dangerous. But when she came, they made every moment count, filling hours with conversation and comfortable silence, with reading aloud from books they both loved, and creating new memories to sustain him through the centuries ahead. She brought him gifts, small tokens she wanted him to have after she was gone. A lock of her hair braided with ribbon, a journal containing her thoughts and observations from their decades together, a painting she had commissioned secretly showing the cottage in winter because she knew it was his favorite season. And as spring approached, as Clara's 41st birthday came and passed without celebration because she was too weak to leave her bed, Elias found himself doing something he had not done in 3 centuries. He prayed, though he was uncertain whom he prayed to or whether any god would listen to a creature like him. He prayed for mercy, for more time, for some miracle that would let Clara live beyond the physician's grim predictions. But if such prayers reached divine ears, they went unanswered. Because on a clear April evening, when the first flowers were blooming in the forest, Merchant Whitmore sent urgent message that Clara was failing, that she was asking for Elias, that if he wished to say goodbye, he must come immediately regardless of the risks. Elias ran through the forest faster than wind, arrived at the Whitmore house as the last light faded from the sky, and for once did not hesitate before approaching human dwelling. The council's monitors would sense this violation, would report it and recommend punishment. But he did not care any more about rules or consequences or anything except reaching Clara before she slipped away. Merchant Whitmore met him at the door, the old man's face haggard with grief and exhaustion. And he said nothing as he led Elias upstairs to Clara's bedroom, where she lay in the same bed where he had watched her sleep after saving her from fire so many years ago. She looked impossibly small against the white linens, her face pale as parchment, her breathing shallow and irregular. But when Elias entered the room, her eyes opened, and the smile that crossed her face held such joy and relief that it broke what remained of his heart. "You came," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I was afraid the rules would keep you away, that I would die without seeing you one final time." "Rules be damned," Elias said, kneeling beside her bed and taking her hand with gentleness that belied his supernatural strength. "I would violate every law ever written to be with you in this moment." He felt her father's presence behind him, but could not bring himself to care about propriety or appearances, could focus only on Clara's face and the terrible knowledge that this was goodbye, that after 41 years of her being in his world, she was about to leave it forever. Clara's hand tightened weakly around his, and she struggled to draw breath for words she clearly needed to speak. "Thank you," she managed finally, "for saving me that night, for giving me 27 extra years I would not have had without you. Thank you for loving me despite all the reasons you should not have, for showing me that monsters can be more human than humans, that love transcends the categories we try to impose on it. My life was richer because you were in it, Elias. And I do not regret a single moment, even knowing how it ends. I regret everything, Elias said. And tears fell freely now, because there was no longer any reason to hide them. I regret that loving me cost you the life you should have had, the husband and children and normal existence you deserved. I regret that I could not save you from this, that all my power and age and supernatural nature means nothing against the simple failure of a human heart. I regret that we did not have 50 years, that you are dying at 41 when you should have had decades more. But Clara, I do not regret loving you. Will never regret choosing to be in your life, even though I knew this moment would come. You gave me back something I thought I had lost forever, and I will carry that gift through whatever centuries remain to me. Clara smiled again, though it clearly cost her tremendous effort. No regrets then, she whispered. We loved each other well, Elias. Loved each other truly, despite every obstacle and limitation. That is enough, has to be enough, because it is all mortals ever get. The difference is that most people do not love vampires, do not face the particular grief of leaving someone behind who will remember them for centuries. But you will remember me, will you not? Will keep me alive in your memory, even when everyone else who knew me has turned to dust. Forever, Elias promised, lifting her hand to press against his cold cheek, feeling her warmth bleeding away, even as he tried to hold on to it. For as long as I exist, I will remember Clara Whitmore, the girl who argued philosophy with ancient vampires, who loved a monster without fear or reservation, who gave me 50 years of grace I did not deserve. You will never be forgotten, never be lost to time, because I will carry you with me through every century ahead. Clara's breathing grew more labored, her eyes beginning to close despite her obvious effort to keep them open. Elias, she said, and his name on her lips sounded like prayer or absolution. When I am gone, find joy again. Not immediately, not until grief has run its course, but eventually. Find something or someone that makes existence bearable, that gives you reason beyond simple survival. Promise me you will not spend eternity alone, will not let my death freeze you into the same isolation you knew before we met. I cannot promise that, Elias said, because the thought of loving anyone else, of replacing what they had built together, seemed like betrayal. How could I ever find someone who understands me as you do, who sees past the monster to whatever humanity remains? You are irreplaceable, Clara. There will never be another you. Then do not replace me, Clara whispered, and now her eyes were fully closing, her hand going limp in his grasp. Just let me be first of many rather than only. Let me be foundation rather than entirety. You have centuries ahead, Elias, and I want them filled with life rather than mourning. Promise me. I promise, Elias said, lying to comfort her even as she died because refusing her final request would have been too cruel. I promise to live fully, to find joy again, to honor your memory by becoming more rather than less. He leaned close, his lips nearly touching her ear, and spoke words he had never permitted himself during her life. I love you, Clara Whitmore. I have loved you since you were 12 years old, and whispering thank you with smoke-damaged voice. I loved you at 16 when you declared yourself mine, at 39 when you told me your heart was failing, and I will love you beyond the end of time itself. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, and I will carry you with me until this curse releases me from existence. Clara's final breath escaped her lips like a sigh, and Elias felt her heartbeat stop, felt the warmth drain from her body as death claimed what life could no longer sustain. She was gone, this extraordinary woman who had fought vampires and challenged ancient laws and loved him despite every reason not to, and the world felt suddenly emptier for her absence. He stayed kneeling beside her bed long after her father came to gently pull him away, long after the physician arrived to confirm what they all already knew, long after proper mourning rituals should have begun. And when he finally rose, when he finally released her cooling hand, Elias felt something fundamental shift inside him. He had loved and lost before, had buried daughter and wife in his distant human life, but losing Clara felt different, felt like losing part of himself that could never be recovered or replaced. She had known him completely, had seen both monster and man, and chosen to love all of it, and without her witness he felt less real somehow, less anchored to anything beyond simple existence. The council's monitors would be waiting when he returned to the forest, would levy punishment for violating his banishment conditions by approaching the village. But Elias found he did not care about their judgment or his fate. Clara was dead, and everything else seemed trivial by comparison. Merchant Whitmore arranged her funeral for 3 days hence, a proper service in the church where Elias had once sheltered from daylight in the crypt beneath. He could not attend, could not enter the village again without inviting immediate retribution from the council. So he watched from the forest edge as they laid her to rest in the cemetery behind the church. He watched as her father wept, as villagers who had known her spoke meaningless platitudes about her goodness and wisdom, as they lowered her coffin into earth that would eventually reclaim her body. And he stayed long after everyone else had gone, stood vigil through the night until sunrise, forced him back to his cottage and the death sleep that awaited. When he woke that evening, Katerina was waiting in his cottage, the same vampire who had escorted him to judgment decades ago. Her ancient face held something that might have been compassion or pity, and she watched him rise from his death sleep without speaking immediately. Finally, when Elias had fully regained consciousness, she spoke in voice that carried both sympathy and inevitability. "The council has noted your violation of banishment conditions," she said formally, though her tone suggested she took no pleasure in delivering this judgment. "You approached the village, entered human dwelling, revealed your presence to multiple witnesses. Under normal circumstances, this would warrant immediate standard punishment, transformation to pure predator, as originally decreed." She paused, and something shifted in her expression. "But these are not normal circumstances, and the council has chosen to be merciful once again. Clara Whitmore's death was noted, your grief observed, and the decision has been made that your violation was understandable if not excusable. You will face no additional punishment beyond what you already bear, and your banishment will be considered complete as of today. You are free to return to vampire society to seek the company of your kind after 27 years of isolation." Elias stared at her, processing words that should have brought relief, but instead felt like ashes in his mouth. "Free," he repeated flatly. "I am free to return to the very society that forced me to watch the woman I loved age and die, that forbade me from truly being with her, that monitored our every interaction to ensure I followed their rules. What a gift!" Katerina's expression tightened, but she did not rise to his bitter tone. "The council showed you mercy twice, Elias Thorne. Once by modifying your punishment when they could have destroyed you completely, and again, now by declining to punish your violation when law would support it. Do not mistake forbearance for approval or sympathy for weakness. You broke the ancient covenant knowing the consequences, chose to love a human, knowing how it would end. The pain you feel now is the price of choices made. Nothing more and nothing less. The pain I feel now is the price of being human enough to love and immortal enough to survive the loss," Elias corrected, and his voice carried centuries of weariness that even Katerina's ancient age could not quite match. "The council's mercy gave me 27 years with Clara, and I am grateful for that, even as I curse the fate that took her from me. But do not pretend that their forbearance was kindness. True kindness would have been letting me die with her, releasing me from this curse so I could follow her into whatever darkness awaits. Instead, I am left to exist without her, to carry her memory through centuries that will eventually fade it to nothing. To survive when survival feels like the cruelest punishment of all." Katerina stood, preparing to leave, but she paused at the door to deliver one final message. "Lijun, the council member who argued for your modified punishment, asked me to tell you something. He said that grief is the price we pay for love, that the depth of your pain is measure of how fully you lived during Clara's life. He said that in another 400 years, when your banishment would have ended under the original sentence, you will have forgotten what her face looked like, will struggle to remember her voice or her laugh. But right now, in this moment, she is vivid in your memory, real in ways that time cannot yet diminish. He said to embrace the grief, to let it carve you open, because that acute pain is proof that love mattered, that Clara's life had meaning that transcends her mortality. And he said that eventually, when centuries have dulled the sharp edges of loss, you will remember her not with agony but with gratitude, will understand that 50 years of grace was worth millennia of mourning. She left then, disappearing into the night, and Elias was alone again in his cottage, with only memories and grief for company. He thought about Li Jun's message, about the ancient vampire's assertion that grief was proof of love's value, and found himself both comforted and devastated by the philosophy. Clara had asked him to find joy again eventually, to let her be first rather than only, but right now joy seemed impossible, seemed like betrayal of the woman who had defined his existence for nearly 3 decades. But he had promised her, had given his word that he would live rather than simply exist, would honor her memory by becoming more rather than less. And Clara Whitmore had never asked anything of him that he had refused, would not start now, even though she was beyond knowing whether he kept his promise. So Elias made a choice, the same kind of choice he had made 41 years ago when he heard a child's heartbeat and decided rules mattered less than life. He would survive his grief, would carry Clara's memory through whatever centuries remained, would eventually find ways to fill his existence with purpose beyond mourning. It would take time, perhaps decades or even centuries, but he would do as she asked, because loving her meant honoring her wishes even after death. He would remember her always, the girl who fought vampires and loved monsters, who gave him grace he did not deserve, and asked only that he live fully in return. She had been right about so many things, this extraordinary human woman, and he would trust her wisdom one final time. The cottage grew cold as night deepened and fire burned low, but Elias remained sitting in Clara's chair, the journal she had given him open on his lap, her words from decades past, speaking to him across the void her death had created. And somewhere in the reading, somewhere in the gentle wisdom of her observations and the fierce love threaded through every page, Elias felt the first stirring of something beyond grief. Not joy yet, not healing or acceptance, but possibility. The faintest suggestion that life might continue, that centuries ahead might hold meaning beyond simple survival, that Clara's gift to him had been not just love, but example of how to live fully, despite knowing it would end. She had spent 41 years knowing she would die while he continued, and she had chosen to love him anyway, had filled their time together with grace and courage that had transformed his existence from mere survival into something approaching life. He could do no less in her memory, could not let her death reduce him to the cold creature he had been before she argued her way into his heart. So, Elias Thorne, vampire of 347 years, sat in an abandoned cottage deep in the Carpathian Mountains and made a vow to the memory of Clara Whitmore. He would live as she had asked, would carry her love forward through whatever centuries remained, would prove that monsters could be redeemed not through grand gestures but through simple act of honoring promises made to those who saw humanity in them. It would not be easy, would require surviving grief that felt like drowning, but he had survived 300 years of darkness before she lit his world with her presence. He would survive this darkness too, would emerge on the other side, carrying her light within him, proof that love between mortal and immortal was not doomed tragedy, but grace that transcended the boundaries of time and death. Clara Whitmore had loved a vampire, and that love had saved him in ways far more profound than pulling her from flames. Now he would spend his immortality proving her faith was not misplaced, that monsters could become more through being loved, that the rules worth breaking were the ones that prevented choosing compassion over convenience. Outside, spring continued its ancient rhythm, flowers blooming and birds singing as if the world had not fundamentally changed. But inside that cottage, in the heart of a vampire who had learned to love and learned to grieve, something eternal had been born from mortal love, something that would survive long after Clara's bones had turned to dust and her name was forgotten by everyone except him. She had given him forever, and he would fill it with memory of her grace. That was the promise, the vow, the sacred obligation that would define his existence through whatever centuries came next. Clara Whitmore had loved him, and he would make, certain that love mattered, would honor it by living fully rather than simply enduring. It was the least he could do for the woman who had taught a monster what it meant to be human, who had shown him that some rules were worth breaking and some loves were worth any price.